This is the Geopolitics and Empire podcast, and we speak once again with Sune Sorensen. He is the founder of Librarium Associates, which is a global research facility focused on big macroeconomic and geopolitical trends, serving institutional and private investors. We'll be talking about Sune's new report, which examines the rise of China. The report is available for listeners to download and includes contributions from geopolitical heavyweights such as Harald, Malmgren, and Millenial macro research. And before we start the interview, I would like to remind listeners to subscribe to all our media channels, and please leave us a rating and review on iTunes or wherever you listen to the podcast. There has been some funny business going on lately. 10 ratings from our Apple iTunes recently disappeared. Hopefully that was just a glitch. But in any case, let me just read a recent review from a listener in the UK who says, quote, "I have listened to this show for the past year or so, always brings diverse and expert insight applying the lessons of history and its geopolitical fault lines to the most important matters in our world today," end quote. And all right, on to our guest. Welcome back, Sune.
Thank you very much. Happy to be back with you.
So this is going to be a bit of a lengthy conversation and deep dive into China because it's a really good report, and I'll share the link so people can download and read it. I'd like to start with a quote from a recent interview by geopolitical expert Bruno Macias. He did an interview, and his analysis seems to go well with yours. Bruno believes it's important to think of China's rise in much broader, even generational terms. Belt and Road is the Chinese plan to build a new world order, replacing the US-led international system. By building massive amounts of infrastructure across Eurasia and even throughout Africa, China is setting up a new power structure that will be unrivaled in the modern era. Whoever is able to build and control the infrastructure linking the two ends of Eurasia will rule the world. And more than any other project, it has come to symbolize a new phase in China's rise, the moment when Beijing embraces its role as a new superpower, capable of remaking the world economy and attracting other countries to its own economic orbit and ideological model. And given its massive scale, it's not surprising that Bruno and other observers contend that BRI is simply too large, too vast, and too complex for any one person to understand. He doesn't even think senior Chinese officials who supposedly run this thing fully understand what it is and what's going on with it everywhere around the world, end quote. And so I will say that your 142-page report runs along similar lines, where in your intro you say it'll be a messy exploration of complex human systems in the context of many moving parts and a lot of noise, muddy waters, and very few detailed and reliable data points. You look at 4 key areas of the China Dragon: trade, technology, the financial system, and military. And you say that China thinks different to the West. It doesn't want to be part of its club as a subordinate, but wants to right the wrong of the century of humiliation, reestablish itself not only as the regional Asian player, but also a global player, and regain China's lost greatness. Above all, it wants absolute sovereignty. So we can look at China's ambitions and its intentions according to what China thinks and not what the West thinks. So take us away, Sune.
Absolutely. What an introduction. Yes, first of all, a big shout out to Dr. Harald Malmgren and Tim, the principal at Millenial Macro Research, who helped me do this report and, have a big role to play in that. And it was also an interesting experience because obviously Dr. Malmgren is a boomer. I'm a Generation X, and obviously Tim is a millennial. So it was kind of a cross-generational work with people from all around the world, different walks of life, which is what we like to do here. So, I mean, obviously, as you outlined it there, the report is kind of the end result of maybe a couple of years of really exploring these different subjects around the Chinese rise, around the technology specifically, trade, financial systems, and obviously the kind of military components of it. I'd never actually done it all collectively, and I decided, now was the time as the kind of trends are pushing in a direction where this would be very relevant to have a better understanding of, a sense of the path ahead. We've worked on this report for 3 or 4 months. We had a lot of good feedback, which is kind of what we try to achieve. And, it's not that we are so interested in, I'm personally not so interested in telling people what to think. It's more about making people think. And certainly the responses we got for the report means that people have been provoked to come to some personal thoughts about it, maybe coming at it in a slightly different way. And we start out the report with kind of highlighting some of the general errors. We quote Mr. Hoyer, who's looking at structured analysis for intelligence purposes, and he talks about this mirroring, where I find that a lot of conversations in the West has been about seeing the world from a Western perspective, based on our experiences, ambitions, and hopes. And again, I think that is going through business leaders, political leaders in the West, whereas China has seen the world from a different perspective, and so has many other nations around the world, where they come with a different historic perspective. They have different interests that are not necessarily fully aligned with the Western narrative. And I think that's led to some misunderstandings, and I think the kind of sense of panic, if you like, that has broken out the last couple of years in the Western world. A lot of these things are deep-rooted stuff that has really been going on since the 90s, at least, and even further back, if you want to go back to sort of 100-year century kind of perspective. You mentioned Bruno's work and his references there. I think, for example, I specifically did not use the BRI as a segment in this, because I actually think it's something much broader and deeper than just what is normally the headline associated with it and the narrative that surrounds it. I think you can go back to the 1990s. And I think what I try and do, or we're working on in the report, is really trying to understand China's push to, first of all, become self-sustained, and from there to build a system, build around itself and its interests and ambitions, and from there, to be what it sees itself as its rightful position at the center of Asia, the Eastern Hemisphere, and obviously with that a broader role in the world. So that's kind of the scope of the report. As I said, there's 4 different key areas that we go into, and we can obviously go into those a bit more.
So, we can go a little bit linearly or chronologically through your report, and some of the first thing you talk about is food security, which is important for every country, including superpower. And you write about how China's food production has jumped, and the level of malnourishment of the population has greatly declined, I think from something like 23%, and you mentioned it went down to 8%. But it's still not enough, because there's a huge population. It's still not enough, as you say, going forward in terms of sustainability. And you write that China's food solution looks to be the Eurasian heartland, including the Arctic. And I know I'm currently living in Kazakhstan, and there were a lot of problems when the Kazakh government wanted to lease some land to China, which I assume would be used for growing food. And the Kazakh population pushed back against that. We'll see where that goes in the future. So what are some key takeaways, for example, on China and food?
Yeah, so again, obviously, when we looked at the trade segment, obviously well documented them as an export power, and how their rise have come on the back of being, a trading nation, and they're now the premier trading nation in the world, which is what they've achieved in 3 or 4 decades. But obviously, when you look internally and you look at some of the motivations of the Chinese leadership, obviously they have this kind of focus on stability, which is what, and their kind of role as a leadership group relies largely on them delivering economic growth, and obviously a stable and better society, a reality for its population. So fresh food and water is a key component of that. If you look at the old saying, a hungry man is an angry man, and obviously from leadership, what they don't want is a lot of angry people running around the streets. So that brings you to probably priority number 1, really, which is obviously the supply of food and fresh water. In the report, we kind of go really into the granular aspects of this, of how they actually managed to internally secure a lot of this in terms of grains, in terms of a lot of key components of actually being able to feed their own population, and at the same time, not just getting by, but actually as we say, moving people out of poverty on a large scale and into a better dietary habits and solutions. Then we look at a lot of where those answers are coming from, and obviously they are trying to not become too reliant on any one block. That's been one of the status quo statements out of any Chinese leadership. There's a lot of this thing about it's all sea driving this change. But in fact, if you go back to Deng Xiaoping in the 80s, he talks about pretty much the same things about not being reliant on the world, but taking what is required and building upon it a Chinese system. And again, in food and fresh water, which kind of is obviously ingrained in each other, because agriculture requires a lot of fresh water. Eurasia is the answer to them. It takes it away from the sea lanes, mainly the nations in there. more broadly aligned with China's interest than the US, for example, historically. And obviously you have this huge part of that, which is Russia, which we also look more specifically into. Kazakhstan, as you mentioned, another big component in that. And it spills over into the energy space, which is perhaps after the food and fresh water, one of the key components that China wants to have control over in order to control its own destiny. So Eurasia as a whole has obviously vast agricultural spaces. Large part of Russia's agricultural heartland has actually been abandoned because of lack of investment over 3 or 4 decades, and that's coming and being turned around, and you're seeing more Chinese investment in that, a co-investment in that. But as you mentioned, in Kazakhstan, there's obviously going to be pushback. This thing is not something that is just going to flow steadily ahead of them in a perfect line. There's going to be ups and downs, and there's going to be pushback. But if you look at longer term trends, these are sparsely populated parts of the world with massive resources and a need for infrastructure, a need of investment, and economic opportunity for their populations. And, the dragon on the coast is the answer. And they're going to have to find some accommodations, whether that is in a co-beneficial exchange, or whether that becomes more weighted to one or the other. Time will tell, but certainly the answers are there, the solutions are there. And more importantly, from the report, it's all very well to speak about theoretical, but the reality is that what we've done looking at the last 4 decades is that there is actually very much what we see is a strategy. There's decisions being made at the center of it, and there's actually follow through. So you're seeing the investment, you're seeing the output growing out of it, you're seeing the trade come out of it. If you look at the kind of BRI link, it's very clear. The exports are coming both ways. Raw materials are coming out, and finished goods at a higher and higher degree of technology, whether that's your 5G or other systems are being sold widely throughout the region. So China is managing to create export markets for higher and higher technology goods, and they're managing to secure the raw materials they need.
And all right, you mentioned one of the next important factors was energy and oil. You write in the report, China is the largest oil importer, and it's also pressing countries to trade oil in national currencies instead of the dollar, which is a trend anyways. You write that shifting just a part of global oil trade into yuan could be potentially huge. And so, there are advantages and disadvantages here for China being the largest oil importer. What are your thoughts on energy and oil?
Yeah, so energy is an interesting one. It's one of the areas that I covered a lot in terms of the commodities around in that space, and obviously the technologies around it in the renewable space. So it's actually I use it in the report as kind of one sort of path to look at in terms of setting out strategy, trial and error around the world, and building out new strategies, and this continued 5-year plan building upon the next one, and actually having some follow through. So if you go back to the 90s, China's first kind of going out to try and to secure energy resources was really one where they went and said, okay, we can't rely on big Western oil companies or the traditional big players in the Middle East. So we are looking for a vacuum where we can go out and perhaps secure our energy destiny. They made a lot of mistakes in that process. They ended up in places what we call rogue nations at the time, the Sudans, the Venezuela, which is still playing out today, and across Africa in places where there was no real infrastructure, some of the riskier parts of the Middle East and Iran before the actual JCPOA deal. Most of that ended up being a waste of money and hasn't really delivered. So when President Xi came into power, he kind of looked at what had been going on for the decade before in that space, and realizing that they hadn't really come any much closer to any real solutions of securing their destiny in terms of being able to secure supplies of energy. So they went in a different direction. They focused on renewables, which was a new industry where they felt they could build pretty much at the nexus of 2 major trends, one in transportation going to electrical vehicles, and one in terms of renewable energy being a better supply source, and both of them relying heavily on technology. And again, they wanted to be technology leaders, so it links and floats over into the technology space. But what they did was a comprehensive thing, leveraging what they have as strength, which is this full government, full everything, military, industry approach to things. They went out and secured the raw materials with deals by lending to nations to develop their resources, whether that's in lithium or in any of the other kind of energy metals, and it also goes into natural gas, oil, etc. So the same strategy plays there. But they build up the full into the chain. They build up the technology, whether it's battery technology, where they're hugely dominant now. They secure the lithium, the processing of it, and all the kind of strategic raw materials around it. And they build out this renewable industry where they're now a leader across both the transportation segment of it and the renewable energy largely. And they, at the same time, realize obviously we need natural gas and oil, we need uranium, we need to build out all these industries. So again, the answer for them largely lied in the Eurasian heartland and with Russia specifically. So again, they avoid the sea lanes, which has been very much in the news with the Iran situation at the moment. They have it inland, and they're building pipelines through. They're developing large parts of Siberia. They're pushing into the Arctic, which you mentioned about, and obviously they have huge deals with, for example, Kazakhstan and other nations in Eurasia for the supply of oil and gas. And again, a lot of this is done via loans. The Chinese companies building infrastructure, providing the steel, the metal, etc. for it. And often it's linked with refineries, chemical production, and building basically an economy around these places, which is real value for the countries across Eurasia, and obviously real strategic value and economic value for China. So again, it's not going to be a perfect run, but you can really see again there that they have set it on a strategy. They run 3 or 4 decades of it. They made some mistakes, they learn from them, and they build it back out again. And that, again, is something that repeats throughout the areas we covered in the report.
What about the financial now? I think briefly last time we did an interview, we discussed the U.S. dollar world reserve. And in this report, you briefly mentioned how, there's like two extremes to this, where some people have this alarmist view that the U.S. dollar reserve won't last much longer, while others have a more moderate view, where it will go on still for decades. And so we see the internationalization of the yuan, and financially China is establishing all this infrastructure regionally and globally, alternatives to SWIFT, all these infrastructure banks giving loans. So they're building this complete global infrastructure. So what's your take on the financial aspect of China's rise?
Yeah, so again, out of the 4 areas we covered, the financial system, I think naturally, if you're going to do it right, would have to be the fourth layer that is going to expand. So again, if you just go out and build any, as we can see all around the world, there's people who've been building so-called financial hubs. It was kind of the buzzword for a while. And, you can build the infrastructure, doesn't mean people will come or the money will flow. So for China, I think they've probably realized that, and they have themselves indeed done a lot of the financial hub bus kind of movements, and it hasn't really done a lot early on. So again, what they've done is build out the trade system and their foreign direct investment systems, and they've done it very conservatively and pretty slowly. So they're building up the infrastructure for this changeover, because naturally, if you look historically, when you have a major tipping point towards trade being directed from one place to another, you're becoming a major trading nation, indeed the number one. If you're a major foreign direct investment player across areas where you're not facing a lot of competition, so you can look at Africa as one of the earlier places, you can look at pockets of South America, and you can look at Eurasia. Suddenly you have, huge swaths of the global population in the system, though now it's dollar-based, euro-based. Has been historically based around some of the infrastructure like SWIFT, or indeed financial markets in the West, or in Hong Kong, which is kind of a medium in between. But slowly they've built out the infrastructure. They have their own solutions, so that gradually, once this pendulum has swung in the trade and the foreign direct investment space, it's becoming supported, or at least could be supported, by an infrastructure that is increasingly being built out. Then I think the final push you look at for financial change, it happened to the US. When the US took over from Europe, it was a long, gradual process. And eventually the infrastructure was built out. And then you need 2 things. You need a catalyst for people to be pushed in that direction, whether that's the opportunity or whether it's risk in other parts. And secondly, you need that trust that comes with seeing it actually work. And those 2 are the last steps. And again, I think that's where we are kind of leaning in towards, perhaps. In terms of the reserve currency aspect, I think that is where people are putting the pyramid upside down, because literally that would be the final step. I don't think China has any direct interest in that right now. What they have an interest in is to be able to secure the commodities, the raw materials we just talked about, the energy, the food, etc., in a currency that they can control, so they are not sitting under that double-edged sword of the mighty dollar that can be used to both create prosperity but also can cut them in half if people are not following instructions. And I'm sure that's a lesson they've learned. You can see it again. It's at an early stage, but the more, again, hard to get hard figures because that's not shared, or if it's shared, it's from 2012 or something like this. But if you're seeing many of the deals being done with Russia in Eurasia, certainly in Africa, and in some South American countries, it is very much based on yuan or euros or something in between, where you may have loans in dollars that can be paid back or converted in multiple currencies. And, they're building the infrastructure. I think the whole focus on the reserve currency is looking at it the wrong way. What you want to look at first, logically, is for any country to be truly sovereign, it has to be able to control payment of the key inputs that sustains it as a nation. And that is what they've been doing over the last couple of decades with some success, still a lot more work to be done.
And we can segue. This is a nice transition to technology, where a lot of your report deals with this issue of technology. I was recently reading Kai-Fu Lee's AI Superpower. He was the former head of Google China, and he's a very important figure. And I'm just from reading his book, it seems technologically in many ways China has already won. You write about, and he talks about this leapfrogging in terms of research, development, technology, innovation. China has advanced greatly their intellectual property, research and development, innovation. You give one example of the increase in the use of apps for payment, not just in China but along the New Silk Road. And something interesting, you mentioned that Huawei has been called the East India Company of the current imperial cycle. So there's a lot to talk about regarding the technological aspect, from civilian purposes and economic to the military. So what are your thoughts on China tech, as well as 5G and Huawei? We're always bombarded with these headlines about 5G and Huawei, which are often sensational. So what's your take there?
Yeah, so again, if we go back and take a step back out of it, I think there's an ancient Chinese proverb which says the man who moves a mountain begins by carrying away small stones. And again, if you apply that to the four different categories, in some of them, and I would say trade and technology, they pretty much in the last 4 decades carried away the mountain and built it elsewhere. I think in financial system wise, they're probably further behind in terms of carrying away these tiny rocks of creating real change and moving the mountain. And again, with the military, it becomes a bit more complicated because you can see the strategic level, but you can't see most things are confidential or they haven't really been tested, probably by design. But going back to the technology, it is, as you mentioned, one of the areas where I feel that they made a lot of headway. There's still some gaps, semiconductors being one of them, which is their biggest import. But they've leapfrogged, they've gotten out ahead in certain. You talk about 5G, we talked about renewable and battery technology, for example. You can talk about fast rails, or you can talk about a number of different areas within technology, AI, where they have made real progress, and you would argue that they're certainly well ahead of Europe and in catching up with the US, or close to being at the same level. Yeah, I think with technology, I think the other thing that we kind of got to start with a little bit again is taking maybe a longer view to get a more balanced sense or perspective of things. There's a lot of hysteric talk about, how China got ahead, how China suddenly, people have sort of realized that China is suddenly this dominant nation, and it shouldn't really be a surprise to anyone who kind of watched it more thoroughly. There's focus on how China has cheated its way to technological advancement for its economy, for its military. And certainly they have applied both by all means necessary, if you like, ways of doing this, but also just standard approaches, like actually buying and paying for IP transfers or buying out companies. But if you just look through the prism of the last 70 years, it's easy to deduct that the US has been the most innovative and dynamic technology hub, and as such, you could follow that everyone else is copying what they've been doing, their processes, individual pieces of technology, and at best they're kind of free riders, or at worst they're thieves. However, if you look at the US technological exceptionalism, it was built on knowledge diffusion and IP coming from Europe. people emigrating from Europe after the Second World War, even earlier from the industrialization out of England, moving across the pond. And, Europe before that obviously acquired many of the key building blocks from the Middle East, from the old Greece, from China and Asia. And again, we used the example in the report about how the rapid diffusion of ideas came really from the famed Gutenberg printing press in the 1500s in Europe, and that was pretty much premised on things coming out of China. Printing was invented in China in the 8th century AD, movable type printing in the 11th century, and paper was introduced in the 2nd century AD, and then diffused across the Middle East and into Europe. Europe took these things, applied them, evolved them, and there was a dispersion and developments. They used it for applied mathematics, double entry bookkeeping, cashless payment systems, financial markets, the spreading just by able to have printed books of scientific fact and inquiry. So a lot of the foundations for what happened was built, through a mix of different inputs for over, 500-600 years, 1,000 years throughout the globe. That we've had 100 years where, let's say, one part have been more dominant than the other. It's easy to just take that alone and say, okay, surely they've stolen these things. But if you're thinking a bit longer term and considering these aspects, you can see from China's perspective, they're saying, okay, well, we felt that 100 years, whatever, under the Opium Wars, our civilization was destroyed. Everything was taken away from us. We had our own period of chaos, and we've been basically trying to fast track our own rise. But a lot of the things that allowed, gunpowder came out of China, that allowed, European militaries first, and then the U.S. military to be dominant around the world. Came from us. So why shouldn't we grab some ideas around the place that you guys have managed to do while you were on top? And if you look at it, obviously, individual company-wise, whether it's hacking and stealing ideas, that is a crime. It should be pursued. But in the bigger picture of things, we're all standing on the shoulders of giants, and maybe that should be considered when people are getting into some hysterics around the kind of IP transfer. But as you point out, again, the R&D expenditure, the kind of hybrid approach of Chinese government has led to real advances and some leapfrogging. And again, what happens for the military technology, is used for civilian purposes, and likewise the other way around. So that's an interesting one to look at.
Well, let's look at the military aspect, and I wanted to read two quotes. And by the way, I love your quotes. You include so many quotes in your reports. I guess that's why you're called Librarium Associates, and you're the AKA librarian. So that's true. Here's a quote from Humphrey Huxley in his book Asian Waters, where you quote him saying, quote, "With its military, China plans to ease American supremacy from the Pacific, match Russia's defense capabilities, and replace the U.S. security umbrella with a Chinese one. With its science, it intends to lead in everything from space exploration, nuclear energy, and environmental technology to combat climate change. For China, none of this ambition is seen as new. It's merely a return to its rightful position. This is not an American-style spearing of a ribeye steak. This is the Middle Kingdom with its millennia of experience, understanding the subtleties of spices and sauces, of seafood and vegetables, culture, politics, and government. This is how it was before. Centuries earlier, China's technological and economic power had dwarfed that of Europe's," end quote, which is kind of what you were just mentioning. And some of the other stuff in the report you talk about, Xi Jinping has sought a 21st century style military industrial complex with Chinese characteristics, something that kind of surprised me. You wrote about how an example of how China's global navigation system can be integrated with Russia's to challenge American GPS. You go in depth on the maritime aspect as well, China's Navy, how it's rapidly catching up. And, this reminds me of the scenario before World War I, when Germany was developing its Navy rapidly to challenge Britain. And, you also talk about South China Sea, how they're establishing their first line of homeland defense. And one more quote from Robert Kaplan, which you include, which is very good, from a speech from the German Marshall Fund he gave, I think, last year. China is fighting a war with the U.S. in the South China Sea. It's just that the Americans don't completely realize it, because the Chinese method of war is to win without ever having to fight. The last thing the Chinese want to do is have a shooting match with the U.S. Navy, because they will lose. They will not lose in a generation. They may not lose in a generation at the rate they're going, but they will lose now. So it's a series of little micro steps. Take an island here, build a runway there, do nothing for 6 months, then send an oil rig into disputed waters. After there are international complaints, withdraw the oil rig and take another island. It's a very subtle strategy where any reaction makes it seem like you're overreacting. So in your report, you talk about Chinese conventional forces, Chinese nukes, how the Chinese didn't think it was wise to invest a lot of money in nukes to match America, but rather just to make enough to serve as a deterrent. And you talk about the string of pearls. And so, take us on a tour through the military aspect.
Yeah, so I think obviously once you have the other three components that we discussed being pushed out to a certain level, you're going to push up against something, and in this case, the US. So obviously then that leads into the military, which again, from the Chinese perspective, and as you allude to a little bit with Mr. Kaplan's excellent, insightful quote there, China believes in not having to fight an outright war in the Western terms of kinetic, navy on navy, or everyone lines up on a big field and starts shooting at each other. Has not really been historically their way of getting things done. So, if you look at just the pure why we are coming into a space where, certainly the military aspect was important to consider, there is a conflict between the US and China that involves fundamental issues of power. China is unwilling to accept US leadership or hegemony in the world going forward as it's grown, and it doesn't historically see itself as a secondary power. The US is unwilling to accept Chinese leadership or hegemony in Asia, because then that brushes up against their established interest there. So there's a clear emergence with China as a dominant regional power in Asia. And as I said, it challenges US interests. So the underlying cause of friction between the US and China is fundamental and inherent. So its core is a difference over balance of power, first in Asia and then in the world. So there's no real easy solutions, or there's no real solutions to it. So then it's what path is taken. And again, if we look at Chinese strategy over, let's say, 3 or 4 decades, which we kind of consider in the report to get a comprehensive picture of it, they basically looked again at lessons from certainly the Soviet Union, US Cold War, and flashes of hot war here and there. They looked at things in the Middle East, where the US has obviously more recently been engaged, and they come to some conclusions. Some of them being that there is battles that are just not worth fighting at all. It's this thing about, I think it's Sun Tzu quote is, avoid the solid or the areas of strength and strike at the weak. And again, you can look at that in terms of Navy, for example. So, the US is so far ahead in being able to project power on what you call the blue oceans, or out in open areas around the world. And again, if you look at nuclear, I mean, I think between the US and Russia, they have, or the old Soviet Union and Russia, they have like almost 90% of all nuclear weapons. So you could either go out and spend billions and billions and billions on trying to build out your fleet of carriers for the Navy and try and challenge the US in open seas. So you could go out and try and catch up nuclear-wise. China decided to go a different route, I believe, based on what we studied over the last 3 or 4 decades. They went for the unconventional. They went for deterrence in the areas where they saw strength. So again, if you look at the South China Sea, I think it's something that gets a lot of coverage. I don't actually think China, beyond trying to just protect their inner layer so that they can basically, for now at least, seal off an access route to put pressure on China. They've done that, obviously, as you talked about, through trade and trying to go through the heartland Eurasia as opposed to bringing things in by sea. That's still a work in progress. In terms of defending their coastline and making it so difficult in terms of deterrence to consider an attack on Chinese mainland through the South China Sea, they obviously built the islands. There's a lot of progress in terms of building out their submarine fleets, and we talked a lot about the drone aspects of smart sea mines and various tools to basically offset US sea power, at least within the coastal region of China. But I think where they said here are areas where we can push back, where we can get ahead, and where we can leapfrog. You go into the unconventional space, and you see some of the strategic aspects that Mr. Kaplan alludes to. I think in the report we quote Mr. Matza, who's at the U.S. Army War College. Basically, he writes for the Advancing Strategic Thought series, and he has a report that came out, The Gray Zone, Understanding a Changing Era of Conflict. And he says, to quote him directly, he says that the Grey Zone warfare is about being unwilling to risk major escalation with outright military adventurism. The actors are employing sequences of gradual steps to secure strategic leverage, and the efforts remain below the threshold of what would generate a powerful U.S. or international response, but nonetheless are forceful and deliberate, calculated to gain measurable traction over time. And in one important sense, they are very classic, using again the Kaplan quote, salami slicing strategies, fortified with a range of emerging gray area and unconventional techniques, from cyber attacks to information campaigns to energy diplomacy. They maneuver in the ambiguous no man's land between peace and war, reflecting the sort of aggressive, persistent, determined campaigns characteristics of warfare, but without the overt use of military force. As such, grey zone conflicts is the employment of strategic gradualism, and grey zone campaigns are designed to unfold over time rather than to gain the decisive result all at once. And again, it plays into some of the larger Asian kind of perspectives on strategy. We can talk about the game of Go, which is often used as a kind of a way to look at the differences in thinking. There's actually a Japanese gentleman, Sakata Ayo, who's the grandmaster. He says Go is not about winning through brilliant and spectacular moves. It's about not losing through bad moves. And there's another old Chinese saying is, you can fight a war for a long time, or you can make your nation strong. You cannot do both. And again, the US actually used to adhere to this, and that Europe kind of overextended itself and then came in on the back of it. They kind of lost track of that in Middle Eastern wars in the last couple of decades, while China sat and watched that and probably realized there was a window of opportunity where they could build out their military, they could build out their economic power. They've done so. So we come to a stage now where, to quote another great thinker, George Washington, it is the very nature of power that it will expand until it's checked by an opposite power. And I think we come to a stage now where the US and parts of the Western world has kind of awoken to the reality that there's an opposite power to be checked. The format it's going to be going in, I think China's decision, or if you look at their strategic moves, is very much one of non-confrontation, but for them to try and win without having to fight a conventional war. But time will tell who comes out ahead, and whether China's long game of the tyrants and kind of establishing strategic advantages across economic, technological, and military spheres will enable them to win without having to fight in a traditional sense, or if this increased friction leads to a predictable flare-up in one of the many fire-prone areas building up in the global system, from which a broader fire can catch on and engulf a larger section of the world. We're not short on accelerants, and there's pretty much few responsible players manning the firewatch duties as we speak. So certainly to watch, but I think in the military space, China's chosen to go into the unconventional. They're chosen to match where real strength is with deterrence at a minimum level, and they try to kind of come at it from a different perspective. So again, we talked a little bit about some of the unconventional in our last conversation, but again, if you're looking at using things like hacking, which we go into quite in depth, trying to use electronic weapons, hypersonic weapons, and other tools to kind of offset traditional US power projection, they certainly made some progress with that. But as I said, it is an area where we're talking strategically, but it's hard to get to the actual detail of what is actual capabilities because it's confidential mainly, and number two, because they haven't really been tested, so we don't really know how comprehensive their advantages are in some of these areas.
Yeah, you see, I wasn't joking in your ability and use of quotes, but as you've described all of this, I don't know if you remember that great old famous Microsoft video game Age of Empires. It really looks a lot like that Age of Empires game where the player, the nation rushes out to get the base core resources, establish themselves self-sufficiency in the resources, and then they build up a wall and key points, and then they advance further. So this is really like a real-world live game of Age of Empires. What other key points strike out to you, things that we should know based on the time you spent developing the report?
I think it's important I think there's just, as most things, there's just so much noise, and specifically on this subject right now. I think while I was doing the report the last 2 or 3 months, I pretty much switched on from day to day. Actually, Tim at Millenial was the guy who was kind of manning the ship on a daily basis and sending me and kind of filtering, but I didn't really want to have the noise. I wanted to step back and look at 3 or 4 decades of development. I wanted to take the time to get, that sort of long range perspective on things and actually try and go beyond just, a lot of the commentary you see out there today, across this area is kind of like the sort of US version of the debate team kind of thing, where it's all about having a quick theoretical response versus an actual strategy with nuance, pros and cons in real terms, and actually laying out some kind of strategy and solutions to any of these things. So the report was really about trying to take a step back from that. So again, some of the conclusions that we kind of draw down at the end, or the kind of thought from the journey, as we like to call it, it is that the pendulum of time is on the move. Again, these are not new things. A lot of the trends we talk about in terms of the 4 key areas over the last 4 decades, they're playing out through different leaderships in China, through different leaderships in the West, through different times of good times, bad times. But even if you take a longer step back, and you look just at this kind of civilizational aspect to it, because for the last 70 years, civilization has been meaning mainly to most people that you will see in certainly the media today, Western civilization. But, you think about civilizations as different parts of the world who have the kind of nucleus to build out something sustainable and significant over long periods of history, China being one of those regions. But if you look at like 1900, for example, the Westerners, they composed like roughly around 30% of the world's population, what we call Westerners. The government ruled about, let's say, 45% of the population, then around 48% in 1920. Which is obviously the kind of high points of Western kind of imperialism. In 1993, except for Hong Kong and a few small imperial remnants, Western governments ruled no one but Westerners. And Westerners amounted to slightly over 13% of humanity, which is due to drop back to around 10% by 2025. So quantitatively speaking, the West is constitute a steadily declining minority of the world population. The Western share of global economic output also may have peaked in the 1920s and has clearly been declining since World War II. If you look at China, in 1750, it accounted for almost 1/3 of the manufacturing output. China was around a quarter, and the West was less than 1/5 of the world manufacturing output. By 1830, the West pulled slightly ahead of China, and then we had the real spurt beginning in the mid-1900s. Western share rose dramatically, peaking in, I think, according to some data, in 1928 to around 84%. But by 1980, the West was back down to around 57%. And Asia was obviously on the rise there. And then we've seen this last 3 or 4 decades with Japan, South Korea, the Asian tigers, and obviously China being the major engine behind it, pushing the pendulum back into the other direction. So we shouldn't really be surprised that we have these underlying changes. And along with that comes a whole host of side effects. And some of them are the ones we see playing out in the political spectrum right now. They're the ones playing out in technology, in trade, in financial markets, and the military components of it. And these things are not going away. This is a major trend. And there is no, in the game of chess, once you have a chessmate, the game is over. But in the game of life, as you call it, the game between civilizations, as you referred to, there is no chessmate. There is only the game continues. You may have a setback, but these major blocks of civilizational powers, they're going to be around. If they're not around, then you have even bigger problems. If they were to implode into chaos, then that would be an even bigger problem than China's rise potentially.
What might you say would be one of China's weakest points?
So again, I mean, obviously, short term, you can look at the financial system, which I think is the weaker of the 4. I think that's probably where you might be likely to see some blow up. But I think, as with any major economy, which has its own fiat currency and kind of perpetual debt levels or systems. It'll mop up the mess. It may not be pretty, but they will get through sort of minor issues. So you can look at the financial system. I think that's perhaps an area to look at. But if you look at longer term, or if you look at just sort of fundamental weaknesses, I would look at what is actually one of the perceived sources of power, which is the centralization of power. That can also be a double-edged sword. So, I think again, to go back to the quotes in the report, we look through this aspect through the Ariel and the Durant book, the world history, and they talk about how the lessons of history. It's called, to be fair. That's a great book, by the way. If people haven't read it, they should go get it. They talk about how power always centralizes. Power. They say power naturally converges to a center, for it is ineffective when divided, diluted, and spread. They go on to highlight the prevailing form of government in history has been monarchy, with the following observation: if we were to judge forms of government from their prevalence and duration in history, we should have to give the trophy to monarchy. Democracies, by contrast, have been hectic interludes. And they then talk about some of the best systems where this has functioned. And they go looking at the Roman Empire, and they talk about what they call adoptive monarchy, where the emperor transmitted his authority not to his offspring, but to his ablest man he could find. He would adopt this man as his son. At that time, it was man, because that's how they ran stuff, and trained him in the functions of government and gradually surrendered to him the reins of power. They then go on to show how that came to an end in the Roman period with Marcus Aurelius, who died without a clear succession plan to the ablest man and was succeeded by his own son Commodus, who, as they so eloquently surmised it, soon chaos was king. Again, looked like China had taken on some of these lessons, because they had the system, certainly in the last since Mao, of every 10 years handing over the reins to someone chosen and supposedly very capable, who had kind of been nurtured to take on the position. And what we highlight in the report is the fact that Xi, whether it is to believe that it was just more in terms of headlines, or whether it's something more deep lying, he got rid of the system of succession, which is the weakest point of any dictatorship or any centralized power, is that period of succession where it's all about handing over to someone capable. And again, I think with China, you could look at that as a real weakness. The more you concentrate power, the more you get the appearance of control. But often, the power is, if not validated in real results for the larger population, it will be challenged and questioned, and pressure will build up below the surface. And if you have a society like China, which is hugely with surveillance, with all kind of measures of control built into the system, that can explode pretty quickly if things don't go to plan. And it may appear all is good and all is calm, but below the surface, things could be brewing up. And again, you're looking at the centralized power thing. And if you go into the closer circles of power in China, certainly Xi has gotten to power. He has stepped on a few toes to get there, and he's cleaned out a lot of competition. But China is a big place. There's a lot of powerful families, a lot of powerful interests, and you could see some kind of palace intrigue, if you like, which could lead to either someone competent coming in and taking over, or someone not so competent coming in and taking over. So that would be one of the points of weakness that we refer in the report.
Do you think the recent unrest that we've seen in Hong Kong is organic, U.S. interference, or both?
Well, I have no direct insight in, but I've done quite a bit of work on Hong Kong and have some good contacts, both who work in the region and people who've done much more work on the space than me. I think Hong Kong is an interesting one. We cover it a bit in the financial sector because it has been the gateway in for money flowing into China. It has been a way for Chinese companies from the mainland to raise capital. And it has been a conduit for that. It's also been a conduit for money leaking out of the system, which has then been clamped down upon. You also seen, obviously, you're supposed to have this two different systems, but one nation. But again, obviously China, with their gradual process, seems to have been encroaching more and more on this. And I'm not surprised that you're seeing some confrontations and some upheaval on the back of this, because you have this the Great Bay Area project, for example, which is supposed to encapsulate Shenzhen, Hong Kong, the whole area around it, and create this huge area of technological development, finance, and what have you, lots of infrastructure connecting Hong Kong to the mainland. And you could kind of see it as a gradual way of basically taking Hong Kong, making it less relevant by moving a lot of the finance to Shanghai, for example, or Shenzhen, and slowly basically encroaching on this liberty that was supposed to be there. I think that was the plan. I think perhaps they pushed it a bit too far too quickly, and people are kind of upset about it. I don't really know who started it or whether there's been outside influence. But I think, again, it's an organic thing that the bigger aims, the longer term objectives of China's central control is not really conducive with Hong Kong being kind of a Western sort of hybrid. At some stage, they will either replace it completely and encapsulate it into it, or it will find some way of balancing between the two. I would probably suggest that they felt maybe they pushed a bit too hard, and they're more likely to avoid full-on confrontation under the spotlights of the world, and they will pull back a bit, and then they will come back at it again another way, a bit like the South China Sea reference to Mr. Kaplan's outline of strategy.
All right. Any final thoughts? Should we go and build bunkers in preparation for World War III with China? Should we go and invest in China as this new superpower? What are some of your final thoughts to leave us with?
Yeah, so again, it's our last conversation. If we need the bunkers, then we're not going to need the bunkers, because they're not going to do much in a real full-on escalation of things. So I doubt that will happen. I think it's very interesting to watch all of this, and I think what you should really be watching is perhaps, obviously this is a China-focused report, but we do measure against the US because they are the dominant power in most of these places. But again, when you look at and these kind of aspects, you can see obviously China has made some gains across these areas. But alongside them, so has U.S. major corporations. So the biggest winners, perhaps, of the last sort of 70 years has been U.S. large corporations, certainly China, other emerging economies, commodity producers who kind of been riding this wave upwards of expansion. And obviously the consumer at large around the world has been able to buy cheap goods. And, people have lives that, my grandparents could only dream of in terms of having multiple cars and big screen TVs and, cheap clothes for their kids and all these kind of areas. So that's been some of the strengths. If we're about to revise this and go the other direction, which is what some people on some parts of the kind of communications on this are shouting for, then all of that comes into question. So again, the question becomes, if you believe that this is a very powerful constituency, let's say large corporate interest, for example, let's say some of the major economies that are export orientated, whether that's Germany and whether that's Japan, obviously China and the US, because they are very dominant in IP and services and financial services. So then you're going to ask the question, will this very powerful constituency allow for this to go anything beyond some headlines, some slight renegotiations of terms, and will they actually allow it to be this Cold War that people talk about, this kind of complete bifurcation of the world systems as it is? I would watch that. I would look at the US elections in 2020 with great interest, because I think you're going to see there's going to be an expression of the interest of these. You see it already today. I mean, it's quite interesting. You saw with the Huawei story, you've seen major US corporation actually lobbying on behalf of Huawei in the US to be able to continue to do business with Huawei. It's calling it a matter of national interest, which was what is also used on the other side to shut them out of the US. So again, I don't think it's as clear cut as people want to make it out to. I don't think necessarily we're going to end up with this split. I think what is for sure is the US is going to be big and powerful and dominant in many areas and for decades ahead. I think China will be so as well. And I think we're going to have a natural pushback. I would probably say that, I think in Asia, there's two major powers right now, and one of them is for sure not going anywhere. Okay, the other one may be pushing further back. Okay, and I think, again, if things are allowed to move gradually, which is more in China's interest, and they will get control of Asia, They will still have a powerful Japan, but they will come to accommodations. Japan cannot move away from Asia, so it has to be a part of the system. I think as long as the Russia-China, which is one of the major interesting trends, continues to embrace each other to some degree, where interests are aligned, which seems to be more and more, specifically as the West is pushing back against both of them. That is going to lead to a major Eurasian reality. I think that has some implications for Europe, certainly for the US. So from an investment perspective, there's a lot of things to think about. As I think I mentioned in the last conversation we had, I see a lot of geopolitical aspects building up in the system that is not being reflected in financial markets, which seems to be dancing happily around like, it's a spring day and everything is great. Everything will continue to be as it was. I think there might be a rude awakening in that, and that might be an opportunity to buy into some of these places that has been hugely overvalued. I certainly see none of the major powers stepping back. I think perhaps Europe is caught in the middle between this, will have choices to make to be able to play on both sides of the fence. And I wouldn't be surprised if in a decade or two you're going to see Europe be more Eurasia focused than perhaps it was with the Atlantic kind of relationship. So there's some of my takeaways. I don't think you need to build bunkers, but I think you need to be aware what is actually going on. I think you need to take a longer view on things, and I think it's important to get away from the noise and to try and just think about things from different perspectives and come to your own conclusions.
All right. At the end of your report, you leave us with a meaty bibliography, but are there any good authors, analysts, websites, reading material you suggest offhand on China?
Yeah, so at the back we normally have this segment called "Standing on the Shoulders of Giants," to kind of quote Mr. Newton, which is mainly the key reports that kind of inspired the thinking for this particular writings. So there's a lot to read there. I mean, thousands of pages, I would say. So there's a good place to start. I think what I would maybe do is leave you with a couple of books. I've gone back recently and read "The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order" by Samuel Huntington, which is a very interesting and current read. It wasn't well received when it came out in the late 90s, where people thought the world was, all one big happy place. And he came out and said that's not really the case. And he brings some great historic perspectives into it. So that's an interesting book to read or reread. I talked about the lessons of history, which is quoted in the report. There's another book by Mr. Kaplan. I love Mr. Kaplan's writing, both his travel writings and his more geopolitical writings. But there's one called the Revenge of Geography, which I really like. Has some good China bits in there, and some good Eurasia bits. So I think those are a couple of good summer reads or rereads to kind of get into.
All right. It's always great to talk to Sune Sorensen from Librarium Associates. Be sure to check out his valuable Twitter posts at the Twitter handle @LibrariumViews, as well as the research he produces at librariumassociates.com. You'll find in the description of this podcast the link to download this report, or through the website, you'll be able to contact Sune to get it from him. Any other website that I missed?
I know those are the key points. I would just add that if you go onto our website under the research part, you can request access to all our future reports. So we do this quarterly thing around the world in 8 or so pages, which normally extends well beyond 8 pages, I must admit, these days. But we have one coming out in a week or two, if I can get it finished. And again, if you subscribe there, you will have access to our public available reports as they come out.
All right. Thanks again.
Absolutely fantastic. Have a great summer, everyone. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this Geopolitics and Empire podcast and interview. I would like to remind you that our website is geopoliticsandempire.com, and you can sign up for our mailing list that goes out each weekend with the latest podcast and a long collection of important news headlines. It's good to sign up for the newsletter in case we experience censorship and deplatforming. You can help the Geopolitics and Empire podcast by subscribing to and interacting with all of our channels such as YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Gab, Minds, and Steemit. You can also help us by leaving a rating and review on your favorite podcast platforms such as iTunes, Castbox, Stitcher, Spreaker, and so on. Finally, if you value our work and our mission and would like to see us continue interviewing experts from across the political spectrum, please consider leaving a one-time donation via PayPal or Bitcoin, or becoming a regular monthly supporter on our Patreon. All the links can be found on geopoliticsandempire.com. Thanks for listening.